Let's put my face there. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to week two. I've been pretty impressed with the few focus questions that I've graded so far from week one. In general, just to repeat, what I'm looking for with the focus questions is for you to show that you understand the points of the texts and to show that you can weigh in on them. I want you to evaluate the theses of the authors that you're reading. So far so good. I haven't gotten to the discussion board yet. I want to wait until Sunday night when you all can have a chance to really engage with each other before I come in and give the professor's perspective. But I am looking forward to the discussion board. That's really my best way to start to get to know all of you. So far, I think you're all doing great with this asynchronous format, and want you to keep up the good work. All right, let's put my face out of the way if I can. Where's a good place for my face to live? Right about there. All right, so let's start talking about the Civil War. From the conflicted readings I gave you last week, as well as your own experiences living in the United States of America, I hope it's very clear that we have unresolved debates about the history of the Civil War. Our collective memories of the event are fractured, they're divisive. We absolutely do not agree on key points as Americans, and that's manifested in our very conflicted memory cultures. So, for instance, the Confederate flag. Is that a symbol of independence, tough guyness, blue collar pride? Maybe. Is it a symbol of hatefulness? Can you embrace the symbol while rejecting its more sinister connotations, or does it just need to go? In Delaware County, we've got a movement to ban the sale and display of Confederate flags at our local family friendly county fair, and there's been tremendous pushback, with many proponents of the Confederate flag arguing that protesters need to respect our history, which is kind of a weird argument since our history is that of the people in the North who defeated the Confederacy. Um, so many of the heroes of the Union are memorialized in our county courthouse square, which I have a little picture of right here. This is a postcard from the early 20th century, but it still looks the same today, except we have a fence around it now. So, but again, what is it that makes something our history or their history? Certainly, we have very unresolved issues of race at the core of these debates. But what if we were in a part of the country where remembering the Confederacy was our history? What would be the difference? For instance, if we were in the South, whether one of us was white or black, or a person of color in general. I I hope that you can tell that I want this conversation to migrate onto our discussion board as we really get talking about the politics of Civil War history. The actual Civil War itself caused hundreds of thousands of deaths. It broke millions of families. It destroyed millions of lives. It also decisively ended slavery and brought hope and opportunity to millions of other people. So, why do we still argue about it? I think in the United States, we might be able to learn a lot from Germany. The crimes Germans committed during World War II, especially the Holocaust, were horrible. Guilt for those crimes was spread liberally across virtually all segments of German society and the German economy. When the war ended, Nazism was decisively defeated, something that we didn't have in the United States of America at the end of our Civil War. Uh, they in Germany, they didn't have a brief occupation like the American South did. Arguably, they're still occupied today by the US military. So Reconstruction or denazification in Germany was massive and backed by the power of not one but four occupying militaries. Two of them were considered superpowers at the time. And so naturally, a great many of the perpetrators of Nazi crimes reacted to this occupation, by saying, "What, me a Nazi? No, not me." Then complaining in German that they were the actual victims of Anglo-American bombings, brutal expulsions from Eastern Europe, Soviet mass rapes. Germans certainly suffered too in World War II. So within a generation, though, Germany was integrated economically with its former enemies. The structures that would become the EU were in full swing, and they were the recipients of tremendous American largesse, with US troops still everywhere. Again, I wonder what the American South would look like had this been the policy after the Civil War, had they received massive investment with a military presence to maintain the rule of law. What would racism in the United States look like today had we recognized that that was the point of the Civil War? So it was in this generation that, going back to Germany now, after a generation, that you suddenly had people who hadn't been old enough to participate in the crimes of their elders, who began to call out their elders. This was in the 1960s. Within another generation, people began to seriously soul search in Germany, West Germany. They took this soul searching so seriously that there's even a word for it, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or coming to terms with the past. People would ask questions like, what would I have done if I was there? And much more importantly, how can we make restitution, if at all, for what we've done? What can we do to pay reparations? What can we do to learn from what we've done? Some, of course, said that happened years ago. It's not our problem anymore. We were the real victims. Some even straight up denied the Holocaust. But for the most part, Vergangenheitsbewältigung has led to efforts to pay reparations, to hold criminals accountable, and to enact the kinds of laws and policies, both at home and globally, that are helping to make sure that genocide will become a thing of the past. So certainly it's much more complicated than this, but from my perspective as an American, I think that Germans have largely owned up to their mistakes, to their crimes. I mean, not mistakes, I don't mean to downplay it, and are stronger for it. One blind spot in German memories for decades had been the suffering of German people. Millions of Germans died from Anglo-American bombings. Millions were exiled from Eastern Europe at the end of the war. Hundreds of thousands of more people died at the end of the war. Yet for much of their post-war history, the suffering of Germans had been rhetorically sort of owned by the far right, so that many more mainstream Germans hesitated to acknowledge their own suffering for fear of seeming like neo-Nazis. So over the past 2 decades, there have been moves for reconciliation in Germany to recognize the suffering inflicted by Germans and on Germans. I wonder if that model just might offer a way out of our own memory politics in the United States. Can we recognize the suffering of people in the South, celebrate Southern culture, I'm fine with grits, and Southern values, while unequivocally condemning slavery, white supremacy, segregation, and racism? Can we recognize that the hundreds of thousands of dead Confederate soldiers represent tragedies like the hundreds of thousands of dead Union soldiers, as well as the millions of people whose lives who were murdered in the Middle Passage, who died in slavery? And is it possible to recognize that suffering while still keeping front and center the horrors that are ongoing today? And can we do more than say racism is bad or that past efforts have fixed it already? Obviously. So for most of the last 150 years, we've been too polarized in our country to recognize one group without feeling like we're diminishing another. In many histories of the Civil War, slavery has been minimized or ignored. It was unquestionably the reason for the war, and its extinguishment is the absolute best legacy of that horrible war. So I'm hoping to pick your brains a little bit and get a bit of a discussion going on this. So let's get into details of a war that needs some serious Vergangenheitsbewältigung, that word again. All right, it always takes me forever to. So I want to start out by emphasizing that the American Civil War really should be seen as part of a global conflict. For starters, American cotton was exported to all of the industrializing areas of Europe and spearheaded the first attempts at the imperialism of the 19th century indirectly in Algeria, Egypt, and India. All of that was for the sake of finding suitable areas to grow cotton to be able to compete with American production. So, one of the ironies of cotton is that it fueled industrialization, which led to newer forms of labor organization, but cotton itself was primarily produced through the ancient system of slavery. Slavery, under the demands of global capitalism, though, led to the worst kind of exploitation the world would see until perhaps the labor camps of Nazi Germany, where you also had slavery driven by capitalism. So, and certainly, I mean, I don't mean to ignore many other examples of this. I mean, certainly the Congo comes to mind. But in both of these cases, human beings were exclusively valued for their productive value, and things like personal autonomy or even family relations received little consideration by masters. Trying to change slides here. So the very global nature of cotton, especially the Atlantic nature, meant that those resisting exploitation turned to the example of other, the resistance to slavery was as transnational as were the economics of slavery. You had the example of the British Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade that had a huge impact on the United States. Another great anti-slavery movement, which that was born out of resistance to sugar. So in 1833, people like Frederick Douglass, a former slave, an eloquent speaker, and a committed activist; Charles Finney, who was a preacher who advocated equality of race and sex; William Lloyd Garrison, who was an abolitionist, who had a newspaper, The Liberator, which was founded in 1830. This was a radical source for lambasting any notion of compromise with slavery. You had Angela and Sarah Grimke, who were both former slave owners who rejected the privileges of their lives to fight for moral truth; Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was an abolitionist and later women's rights leader; Sojourner Truth, she was a former slave and preacher who absolutely electrified people when she spoke. These people, just touching the surface, they would come together to furiously lobby for the end of slavery. They held meetings, they produced media, they they fought for legislation to restrict the expansion of slavery and to get rid of it altogether. They were so feared by Southern politicians that the Mail in the South censored their newspapers and materials. It was a crime for Southerners to have abolitionist literature in many states, which made it easy to make abolitionists out to be scary people who needed to be fought against at all cost. This censorship of free speech in the South is really one of the most important turning points leading to people being willing to fight a civil war. One miraculous mode of resistance that had been around for decades but went into high gear in the 1850s was the broad, dispersed efforts to help runaway slaves, formerly called the Underground Railroad. This is probably the most remarkable and impressive act of civil disobedience in American history. 100,000 people escaped north after 1850 to Canada through the efforts of ordinary resistors. Often these resistors were made up of religious minorities, people like Quakers. More often than not, they were just good people who wanted to make a difference. Harriet Tubman became a hero for her willingness to not only help people in the North, but to head south, to go into the South from the North to lead people to safety. And she was an incredible person. She became a key leader in the women's rights movement after her death, especially the suffragist movement. It'd absolutely be an honor to have her on our $20 bill someday, or whatever currency we decide to put her on. So the sharpening sectional divisions that would lead to a civil war really became apparent in the episode that started in 1856 and lasted until a few years after the end of the Civil War, Bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery forces fought against anti-slavery free staters in Kansas. They used force of arms to try to maintain majorities either for or against slavery, and eventually 56 people were killed. The intense news coverage of this fighting really made most Americans feel like a civil war was already happening 5 years before one officially started. Another key turning point was a person who decided to take matters into his own hands, John Brown. Brown was a staunch abolitionist from Ohio who killed some pro slavery settlers at Pottawatomie in Kansas and then later gained notoriety for his attempt to seize an armor at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, with the goal to give the arms from this armory to slaves to start an uprising. John Brown was used in Southern propaganda as an illustration of how crazy Northerners were. To many Northerners, he was an extremist, what we would call a terrorist today. Harriet Tubman, who was already active in the Underground Railroad, saw him as one of the most inspirational people she had ever met. So, as we fast forward a little bit, during the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln won a majority of the votes, but by no means had unanimous support. The Democratic Party nominated two candidates to run against him. They nominated a Northerner, Stephen Douglas, who had run against Lincoln in the Illinois Senate just a few years earlier, and was famous for his, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and John C. Breckinridge, a Southerner and an unapologetic supporter of slavery. A third party, the Constitutional Party, won some border states with its coalition of anti-immigrant know-nothings and old Whigs who hoped for some sort of compromise on slavery. So when Lincoln won in 1860, so many Southerners entered into crisis mode. If you can toggle this picture a little bit, I know the text is kind of small. It might be easier to read some of the captions. So this cartoon argues that everyone who intolerant Americans at the time disliked, from women's rights advocates right here to immigrants to you've got drunks here to black people. This guy is supposed to be a Mormon. That they all supported Lincoln because they were crazy or destined for I cut this off here, but destined for the lunatic asylum. So you see the Republican Party going to the White House. So for many Southerners, I'm trying to switch slides here. Come on. So for many Southerners, the real problem with Lincoln wasn't that he wasn't a staunch supporter of slavery and had even made statements that he disliked it. In 1858, he was clear that he had so for many Southerners, the real problem was that he wasn't a staunch supporter of slavery. He waffled on the issue, but even waffling was not acceptable to extremists. So in 1858, he was clear that he didn't support slavery, but after the war, apologists for the South have picked apart many of his less black and white statements, like his argument in 1860 that if he could save the Union without slavery, he would. But if he had to save the Union with slavery, he would do that too. Part of the arguments against his purity, which are certainly true, is they argue that he wasn't the heroic abolitionist that sometimes children's histories make him out to be. Ultimately, the real Lincoln was a politician who wasn't willing to take a firm stand, but once the Civil War commenced and he saw opportunities to end slavery, he took them firmly. His first step, the Emancipation Proclamation, ended the practice in occupied Southern territories. It allowed slavery to continue in the Union states of Maryland, Delaware, and Kentucky. Missouri, was sort of a Union state too. So his final legacy was to push through the 13th Amendment shortly before he was assassinated, which ended slavery everywhere, even in states that had fought for the Union. So between the election in 1860 and his inauguration in March of 1861, Southern secession commissioners, there's a great book about it. It was on the last slide that I showed you. Visited the legislatures of the southern states, starting with South Carolina, the first to secede, convincing them that Lincoln was a threat to slavery. And I want to be very clear, for the politicians who voted to secede, the Civil War was 100% about slavery. Some of the arguments they made were that black people were inherently criminals, that they would rape white women if allowed out of slavery, and that slavery needed to be preserved for the preservation of white people. These are the same racist arguments that are untrue and have been with us for centuries. These illogical arguments meant to justify slavery are the foundation upon which our racism is still built. And again, they are nonsense. So with all this anti-Lincoln hysteria in the background, in April 1861, the newly formed Confederate States of America started the Civil War by attempting to take control of federal military forts in the South. On April 12th, they bombarded, then overwhelmed Fort Sumter in South Carolina. In response, on April 15th, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, and he began a blockade of southern ports, that blockade would last throughout the war. It was clear almost immediately that 75,000 wouldn't cut it. Just a few months later, in a special session of Congress held on July 4th, 1861, Lincoln was authorized funds to raise 500,000 troops. Many, many more would join before the war was over. So there were numerous bumbles, especially by the Union, in the first year of the war, as they tried to mobilize against a fanatical South that was far better psychologically prepared for violence. In the South, violence was part and parcel of everyday life, especially the violence against black souls in the attempt to maintain their hierarchy of slavery. So the first battle at Bull Run was a defeat for the Union. It was also only 25 miles from Washington, D.C. In November, there was a particular blunder when the Union Navy seized a Confederate ship with diplomats headed for England. The UK threatened war if the Union didn't release the emissaries. Lincoln gave in, saying, "One war at a time." The next month, French forces landed at Veracruz in Mexico with the hopes to overthrow the new Mexican Republic, which was formed in the aftermath of their humiliating defeat in the Mexican-American War. And they set up a base where they could intervene on behalf. Sorry, a little mistake there. And and they wanted to set up a base where they could intervene on behalf of the Confederacy in the American Civil War. France at the time was in the beginning stages of industrialization and desperately needed the cotton, which was being cut off by the Civil War. Had the Mexicans not defeated them the following spring on May 5th at the Battle of Puebla, that's the origin of Cinco de Mayo, it's very possible that the Confederates would have had powerful European allies and the outcome of the war would have been very different. So while all of these international problems were happening in the background, Lincoln also had problems finding a commander of the army he could work with. His first, George McClellan, was arrogant and too timid in battle, per Lincoln's assessment. McClellan actually ran against Lincoln for president in 1864. Lincoln went through 4 more commanders before settling on Ulysses S. Grant in 1864. For a few months, Lincoln even personally commanded the military. I've got a picture on this slide. It looks like my face is back. It disappeared for a while. That shows a supply station, a Union supply station on the Mississippi River. Both armies struggled with logistics, but the North had far more resources and transportation infrastructure to work with, despite troubled military leadership. So, the real victors of this war were the people who made sure that the armies had supplies and that the armies got where they needed to go. So, 1862 was a horrifying year when Northerners and Southerners both realized it was going to be a long war. Lincoln's main thrust that year was down the Chesapeake, using combined naval and army forces, fighting battles at Shiloh, Bull Run, and Antietam. At Shiloh on April 6, 1862, there were more casualties than in all previous American wars combined. And at Antietam, on September 18, 1862, more people were killed or wounded or went missing than on any other day of the war, about 42,000 on both sides in one day. So this war was mind-bogglingly destructive. The picture on this slide is next to Miller's cornfield at Antietam, where 40 acres of corn was perfectly harvested by gun and cannon fire. After Antietam, Lincoln issued the first Emancipation Proclamation for Southern slaves who could flee to Union lines, not for Northern slaves. And when I say the war was about slavery for the South, it was more complicated for the North. At first, the goal was simply to preserve the Union. So Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, and Missouri, all part of the Union, kept their slaves until the signing of the 13th Amendment. With the Emancipation Proclamation, though, and massive involvement by African Americans, the war became about slavery for many in the North. So 10 days after Antietam, the Delaware County 144th Volunteer Regiment was raised. For those of you who know Delhi in the area, These people mustered on the fields that are now where the Price Chopper Plaza is. 1,409 people joined. Many other people from our county fought in many other units during the war. 588 men from our county died in the Civil War, and the population in the 1860s was about the same as it is today. So there's, I'm always awe-inspired by the monument to these people on our courthouse square in Delhi. New York gave more than any other state to end slavery and to preserve the Union. This is a picture of veterans of the 144th Volunteer Infantry in the 1890s in front of some house on Main Street. I don't know if the house is still there or where it is. Maybe some of you know. So I also want to emphasize some, or at least briefly cover some peripheral theaters of the war as well. On the western frontier, especially places like Arkansas, Kansas, and Missouri, Confederate bushwhackers engaged in absolute terrorist policies against those suspected of supporting the North. One group, Quantrill's Raiders, were Jesse James, who later became a bank robber, outlaw, murderer, has been he's been weirdly celebrated. The Quantrill Raiders too have been weirdly celebrated in so much media, as if they were heroes. There's a vast literature that for more than a century has tried to rehabilitate what's often called the lost cause of the Confederacy. Quantrill's Raiders were essentially lawless bank robbers and murderers outside the control of the Confederacy. In another horrifying example of Western frontier violence, Nathan Bedford Forrest's troops, who's later the founder of the KKK, who still has a statue up in Tennessee, murdered over 200 black POWs in 1864. This lawlessness would continue on the Western frontier for years after the Civil War was over. The violence also included conflicts with Native Americans. For the first, you had the Santee Sioux of Minnesota rebelled because of lack of food and annuity payments that they were supposed to be receiving for having given up their land. Some Sioux leaders thought that enough troops were diverted with the Civil War that they might have some success in their rebellion. They didn't. There were also conflicts with the Navajo, with the Cheyenne during the Civil War, which, those conflicts were justified by the Union as attempts to prevent the Confederates from claiming New Mexico or Colorado for themselves. So these conflicts of the Civil War would lead to the next 2 decades of the Indian Wars, which ended up being perhaps the worst example of American imperialism against its native peoples. Imperialism that most Americans opposed, even as they profited from winning the West. We'll talk about that more next week. The American public, though, was generally appalled when atrocities happened against the natives, but at Fort Ojo de Oso in New Mexico and Sand Creek, Colorado, hundreds of people were killed by frontier soldiers with little military discipline, all while the Civil War was ongoing. 1863, then, was a year of significant turning points in the war. The January 1st Emancipation Proclamation gave many Northerners the moral high ground that they had been looking for. Like I just mentioned, the war was always about slavery for the South, but for the North, it had long been about the vague goal of preserving the Union. Ending slavery was something that many more people were willing to fight for, though many open racists in places like New York City rioted against that draft, the draft that in July of 1863, particularly targeting free blacks as they vented their rage of not wanting to go to war. Rioters in New York City lynched people and even set an orphanage on fire. Troops fresh from victory at Gettysburg had to come to New York City to put down this draft riot. So the Union victory at Gettysburg, though, decisively ended the South's ability to take serious offensive action against the North. The Gettysburg Address later in November would nicely sum up the purpose of the war and inspire people to continue fighting, and at least when I was in grade school, we still had to memorize bits of it, which I never did. I was not a particularly bright child. So after the Emancipation Proclamation, people like Frederick Douglass went into overdrive trying to recruit black troops to fight in their own units. I absolutely love the look in the eyes of these people. Um, Most of these people are former slaves who are now standing tall as they get ready to fight for their own dignity and the dignity of others. These troops gave the Union the extra push it needed and performed with immense bravery knowing that if captured, they would most likely be murdered. The South, by contrast, made widespread use of slaves in their own military, not as soldiers, but as slaves. And in the last month of the war, even mold the idea of using black people as soldiers. This has led to a completely false pro-Southern revisionist history, arguing that black people fought for the Confederacy too. With only a handful of exceptions, that idea is pretty much nonsense. So the day after Gettysburg, the Union took Vicksburg, Mississippi, effectively splitting the Confederacy in half. And the next year, General George Sherman would lead a scorched earth attack on Georgia, burning down homes and crops in a 60-mile wide swath from Atlanta to Savannah, giving good evidence to the theme of Northern cruelty that would feature heavily in the Southern counter-history of the Civil War for decades after that. And they're right, this attack was cruel, murderous, and unnecessary. So the final battles of the war were between Ulysses S. Grant's Army of the Potomac and Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, which Robert E. Lee would finally surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865, and the often worthless, sometimes well-administered policies of Reconstruction that we talked about last week would follow. So, all right, I want you to take a stab at some of these bonus questions, and I'm looking forward to seeing your work for this week. As always, please reach out to me if you'd like to go over anything, and remember that I have office hours every morning on Zoom from 9 to 10 a.m., and I'm also available by appointment. So these bonus questions, what does Vergangenheitsbewältigung mean? And then number two, what do you think is an important lesson that elementary school age children or children in general should learn about the Civil War? And then for number three, how does that lesson compare to the way you first learned about the American Civil War? So what do you think should be the point of this? And and how does that compare to your own experience? So these are meant to be softball questions, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you all have to respond. Thank you.